The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Courtroom 3B, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany benches packed with spectators who had come to witness what should have been a routine traffic violation hearing. It was 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in downtown Los Angeles, and the air conditioning struggled against the California heat that had already begun seeping through the tall windows of the Superior Court building. The only sounds were the occasional shuffle of papers, the quiet murmur of hushed conversations, and the rhythmic tapping of the court reporter's fingers as she prepared for another day of mundane legal proceedings. But there was nothing mundane about what was about to unfold in Judge Patricia Hernandez's courtroom. Seated at the defendant's table was Jamal Washington, a 28-year-old black man whose navy blue suit fit him perfectly despite being purchased from a discount store 3 days earlier. His tie was precisely knotted, his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his hands were folded calmly in his lap as he waited for his case to be called. To the casual observer, he looked like any other defendant hoping to avoid a conviction, nervous but respectful, dressed appropriately for court, trying to make the best impression possible on the judge who would decide his fate. What no one in that courtroom could have guessed was that Jamal Washington was about to deliver the most devastating lesson in judicial humility that anyone present would ever witness. Across the aisle, at the prosecution table, District Attorney Rachel Martinez shuffled through her files with the casual confidence of someone who had tried thousands of cases just like this one. Traffic violations involving young black men were, unfortunately, a regular part of her caseload, and she had developed what she considered to be an efficient system for processing them. Most defendants in cases like this couldn't afford experienced legal representation. Most had prior encounters with law enforcement, and most would accept a plea deal rather than risk the uncertainty of a trial. This case seemed to fit the pattern perfectly. The defendant had been pulled over by Sergeant Rick Thompson, a 20-year veteran of the LAPD whose reputation for thorough police work was well established in the department. Thompson's report described a routine traffic stop that had escalated when the defendant became argumentative and suspicious, using language that any experienced prosecutor would recognize as code for a difficult suspect who had challenged the officer's authority. But Martinez had learned long ago not to look too deeply into the details of police reports. Her job was to prosecute cases, not to second-guess the officers who brought them to her attention. Thompson was a decorated sergeant with commendations for community service and crime prevention. His word carried weight in courtrooms throughout the city, and judges trusted his testimony implicitly. At the defense table, Jamal's court-appointed attorney, Michael Chun, was frantically reviewing his notes for what felt like the 100th time. Fresh out of law school and overwhelmed by a caseload that seemed to grow every week, Chun had been assigned to represent Jamal just 3 days earlier. He'd had barely enough time to review the police report, conduct a brief interview with his client, and prepare what he hoped would be an adequate defense. The case seemed straightforward enough on paper. Jamal had been pulled over for allegedly failing to signal before changing lanes on the 405 freeway. According to Sergeant Thompson's report, the defendant had become agitated and uncooperative when asked to produce his license and registration, leading to his arrest for resisting an officer and creating a public disturbance. It was the kind of case that usually resulted in a plea bargain, reduced charges in exchange for a guilty plea and a promise to complete community service. But something about his client bothered Chun. During their brief consultation, Jamal had spoken with a level of composure and articulation that seemed inconsistent with Thompson's description of an agitated and uncooperative suspect. When Chun had asked about the details of the traffic stop, Jamal had provided a calm, methodical account that differed significantly from the officer's version of events. He spoke with precision about constitutional law, probable cause, and proper police procedure in a way that suggested more than casual familiarity with legal concepts. Still, Chun was a public defender with limited resources and unlimited cases. He didn't have time to investigate every inconsistency or explore every client's background in detail. His job was to provide competent representation within the constraints of an overloaded system, not to conduct in-depth investigations that the court wouldn't pay for and his schedule wouldn't allow. The bailiff, a stern-faced woman named Deputy Sarah Rodriguez, called the court to order as Judge Hernandez entered from her chambers. Patricia Hernandez had been on the bench for 12 years, long enough to develop a reputation for fairness and efficiency, but also long enough to recognize the patterns that emerged in cases like this one. Young men from certain neighborhoods, certain backgrounds, certain demographics seemed to find themselves in her courtroom with remarkable regularity, usually facing charges that stemmed from traffic stops that had somehow escalated beyond their original scope. "The People versus Jamal Washington," the bailiff announced, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged courtroom. Case number BA 2023-8847, charges of failure to signal, resisting an officer, and creating a public disturbance. Judge Hernandez looked down at the file before her, noting the familiar name of Sergeant Thompson as the arresting officer. She had seen Thompson testify dozens of times over the years, and his cases were usually well documented and straightforward. Officers with his experience and record rarely brought questionable arrests to her courtroom. "Is the prosecution ready to proceed?" Judge Hernandez asked. District Attorney Martinez rose from her seat with practiced efficiency. "Yes, Your Honor. The people are ready to present our case." "Is the defense ready to proceed?" Michael Chun stood somewhat less confidently. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense is ready." But as Judge Hernandez prepared to begin the proceedings, none of the legal professionals in that courtroom could have imagined that they were about to witness one of the most spectacular reversals of fortune in the history of the Los Angeles Superior Court system. They couldn't have known that the routine traffic violation they were about to adjudicate would expose a pattern of racial profiling so brazen that it would make national headlines. They couldn't have predicted that Sergeant Thompson's reputation for thorough police work was about to be revealed as something far more sinister. And they certainly couldn't have guessed that the quiet, well-dressed defendant sitting at the defense table was about to demonstrate exactly why you should never judge someone by their appearance, their accent, or your assumptions about their background. In the gallery behind the defense table, a small group of spectators had gathered to observe the proceedings. Most were law students from nearby universities, taking advantage of the opportunity to watch real courtroom proceedings as part of their legal education. A few were community members who made a habit of monitoring local courts to ensure that justice was being administered fairly. One elderly woman in the front row clutched a worn leather notebook, taking careful notes of everything she observed. None of them could have known that they were about to witness a master class in the power of education, patience, and strategic thinking. None of them could have predicted that this simple traffic case would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. Sergeant Rick Thompson entered the courtroom through the rear doors, his uniform crisp and his bearing confident. At 45 years old, Thompson had spent more than half his life in law enforcement, working his way up from patrol officer to sergeant through what he considered to be dedication, hard work, and an intuitive understanding of criminal behavior. He nodded respectfully to Judge Hernandez as he made his way to the witness stand, his polished badge catching the fluorescent light as he walked. Thompson had testified in court hundreds of times, and he knew exactly how to present himself to maximize his credibility with judges and juries. His voice was clear and authoritative. His posture was respectful but confident, and his answers were delivered with the precision of someone who had learned to navigate the legal system with skill and efficiency. What Thompson didn't know was that his years of successful testimony were about to come to a crashing halt. He didn't know that his confident assumptions about the defendant he had arrested were about to be exposed as dangerous prejudices. And he certainly didn't know that his habit of embellishing his reports with racial stereotypes and cultural mockery was about to cost him everything he had spent 20 years building. As the bailiff prepared to swear in the prosecution's first witness, the atmosphere in Courtroom 3B was thick with the kind of routine tension that accompanied most criminal proceedings. Everyone present expected to witness a predictable legal drama. An experienced police officer would testify about a routine traffic stop. A young defendant would either accept responsibility or offer a weak defense, and justice would be administered according to the familiar patterns that govern such cases. But what they were actually about to witness was something far more extraordinary. They were about to see what happens when prejudice meets preparation, when assumptions collide with reality, and when someone who has been underestimated decides to demonstrate exactly why that was a mistake. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change lives, end careers, and provide a lasting lesson about the power of education and the dangers of judging people by anything other than their character and their actions. But before we see how this routine traffic hearing became a career-ending nightmare for Sergeant Thompson, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this expose the reality of prejudice in our justice system, and what happens when someone finally has the knowledge and patience to fight back. The next part of this story will blow your mind, so stick around to see what happened when Thompson took the witness stand and started mocking Jamal's accent. Trust me, the courtroom's reaction was absolutely priceless. Please state your name and occupation for the record. District Attorney Martinez began, her voice carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted this same examination countless times before. Sergeant Thompson adjusted his position in the witness chair, his uniform jacket straightening as he prepared to deliver testimony that he had given in similar cases dozens of times over his 20-year career. Sergeant Richard Thompson, Los Angeles Police Department, West Division. Badge number 2847. I've been with the department for 20 years, currently assigned to traffic enforcement and patrol duties. Judge Hernandez looked up from her notes, giving Thompson the slight nod of recognition that came with familiarity. Thompson had appeared in her courtroom many times before, always professional, always prepared, always credible. His testimony had resulted in numerous convictions, and she had never had reason to question his integrity or his competence. Sergeant Thompson, Martinez continued, "Can you tell the court about your experience and training in traffic enforcement?" Thompson's chest swelled slightly with pride as he launched into his credentials. "I've completed advanced training in traffic law enforcement, DUI detection, and suspicious behavior identification. I've made over 3,000 traffic stops during my career and have received commendations for my work in community policing and crime prevention. I'm also certified in conflict de-escalation and cultural sensitivity training." The irony of that last statement would become apparent soon enough, though no one in the courtroom could have predicted it at the time. "Now, Sergeant Thompson, directing your attention to the afternoon of September 15th of this year, can you tell the court what happened during your encounter with the defendant?" Thompson turned slightly in his chair to glance at Jamal, who sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded and his expression neutral. For just a moment, Thompson's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were sizing up an opponent rather than simply identifying a defendant. "I was conducting routine traffic patrol on the 405 freeway, northbound near the Wilshire Boulevard exit, when I observed the defendant's vehicle change lanes without signaling," Thompson began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had perfected over years of courtroom testimony. "The violation occurred at approximately 2:30 p.m. in moderate traffic conditions." Martinez nodded approvingly. "What did you do after observing this violation?" "I activated my patrol lights and conducted a traffic stop. The defendant pulled over onto the shoulder in a safe manner, which I noted in my report." Thompson's testimony was proceeding exactly as Martinez had expected, professional, detailed, and credible. "And what happened when you approached the defendant's vehicle?" This was where Thompson's testimony began to take a turn that would have far-reaching consequences, though he seemed completely unaware of the dangerous ground he was about to tread. His voice took on a slightly different tone, one that suggested he was about to share something he found amusing rather than simply reporting facts. "Well, Your Honor, when I approached the driver's side window, the defendant immediately became agitated and defensive. He started speaking in a very urban dialect, if you know what I mean." Thompson's eyes flicked toward the gallery, as if seeking support for what he was about to say. He said, and I'm quoting directly from my notes here. Thompson pulled out a small notebook and made a show of consulting it, though anyone familiar with police procedure would have known that such specific quotes were rarely recorded verbatim during traffic stops. He said, "Yo, officer, what I do wrong? I ain't been doing nothing, but driving to work, you feel me?" The mockery in Thompson's voice was unmistakable. He had affected what he clearly believed was an exaggerated urban accent, complete with grammatical errors and slang that transformed Jamal's words into a caricature. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Judge Hernandez's expression showed the first hint of concern. At the defense table, Jamal remained perfectly still, his face showing no reaction to Thompson's performance. Michael Chun, however, looked up sharply from his notes, his inexperience evident in his uncertainty about whether to object to testimony that was clearly inappropriate, but not technically inadmissible. "I see," Martinez replied, though her tone suggested she was beginning to sense that Thompson's testimony was venturing into problematic territory. "And how did you respond to the defendant's statements?" Thompson seemed to interpret Martinez's hesitation as encouragement rather than caution. "Well, I could tell right away that I was dealing with someone who was going to be difficult. You know how it is with these types. They always want to argue, always want to claim they didn't do anything wrong, always want to make everything about race or profiling or whatever excuse they can come up with." Judge Hernandez's eyebrows rose slightly. In 12 years on the bench, she had heard thousands of hours of police testimony, and she recognized the warning signs of an officer who was about to say something that would create problems for everyone involved. "Sergeant Thompson," she interjected gently, "please limit your testimony to the specific facts of this incident." But Thompson seemed oblivious to the warning, his confidence apparently unshakable. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm just trying to provide context for the defendant's behavior." When I asked him for his license and registration, he became even more agitated and started speaking louder. He said. Thompson consulted his notebook again, though his performance suggested he was enjoying the opportunity to recreate what he saw as Jamal's embarrassing behavior. "Man, why you always be harassing us for? I told you I ain't do nothing wrong. Y'all just be stopping us 'cause we black." That's a direct quote from my notes. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Even the court reporter seemed to pause momentarily in her transcription, as if uncertain whether what she was hearing was actually being said in a court of law. In the gallery, several law students were frantically taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would likely become a case study in their ethics and professional responsibility classes. Jamal continued to sit motionless at the defense table, his expression revealing nothing. But those who knew how to read body language might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible straightening of his shoulders, the subtle signs of someone who was exercising tremendous self-control. "And how did you respond to these statements?" Martinez asked, her voice now carrying a note of caution that suggested she was beginning to realize that Thompson's testimony was spiraling beyond her control. "I remained professional throughout the encounter," Thompson replied, though his definition of professionalism was about to be called into serious question. "I explained to the defendant that I had observed him committing a traffic violation and that I needed to see his documentation, but he continued to be argumentative and disrespectful." Thompson paused dramatically, as if building up to the climax of his story. He kept saying things like, "This some bullshit, man. Y'all know this ain't about no signal. This about me being in a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and y'all can't handle seeing a black man driving something y'all think he can't afford." The mockery in Thompson's voice had become even more pronounced, his imitation of what he claimed were Jamal's words bordering on the theatrical. He seemed to be enjoying himself, confident that his audience would appreciate his performance and support his characterization of the defendant as an inarticulate troublemaker who had brought his legal problems on himself. But the atmosphere in the courtroom was becoming increasingly tense. Judge Hernandez was now openly frowning, her displeasure with Thompson's testimony evident to everyone present. Several members of the gallery were shaking their heads in disapproval, and even some of the court staff seemed uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Martinez realized that she needed to regain control of her witness before he did irreparable damage to her case. "Sergeant Thompson, perhaps you could focus on the specific actions you took in response to the defendant's behavior rather than recreating his exact words." But Thompson seemed to interpret her suggestion as an opportunity to elaborate further. "Well, that's the thing, Your Honor. The defendant's attitude and manner of speaking told me everything I needed to know about what kind of person I was dealing with. In my experience, when someone starts talking like that, with all the slang and the attitude, it usually means they're hiding something or planning to cause trouble. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Thompson had just admitted, under oath and in open court, that he had based his assessment of Jamal's character and credibility on the way he spoke, essentially confessing to the kind of linguistic profiling that civil rights attorneys had been fighting against for decades. Michael Chin finally found his voice. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering opinion testimony about the defendant's character based on speculation and stereotypes. Sustained. Judge Hernandez replied firmly. Sergeant Thompson, please limit your testimony to your observations and actions, not your interpretations of the defendant's character or motivations. But the damage was already done, and Thompson seemed completely unaware of how badly he had undermined his own credibility. He continued his testimony with the same confident swagger, apparently believing that his years of experience and his reputation in the department would protect him from any consequences. After the defendant continued to be uncooperative, I made the decision to place him under arrest for resisting an officer and creating a public disturbance. During the arrest, he continued to use profanity and speak in the same urban dialect, claiming that he was being targeted because of his race. Thompson's use of the phrase urban dialect was clearly intended as a euphemism, but it fooled no one in the courtroom. Everyone present understood that he was making assumptions about Jamal's intelligence, education, and character based solely on his perception of how Jamal spoke. The defendant was transported to the station without further incident, Thompson concluded, apparently satisfied that his testimony had painted a clear picture of a routine traffic stop that had escalated due to the defendant's poor attitude and uncooperative behavior. Martinez stood to conclude her examination, clearly eager to move on from testimony that had become increasingly problematic. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Hernandez turned to the defense table. Mr. Chun, do you wish to cross-examine this witness? Michael Chun rose slowly, his inexperience evident in his uncertain demeanor. He had prepared for a routine traffic case, not for a situation where the arresting officer had essentially confessed to racial and linguistic profiling in open court. His law school training had covered these issues in theory, but he had never encountered such blatant bias in an actual courtroom setting. Yes, Your Honor, just a few questions. Chun approached the witness stand with careful steps, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. He knew that this was his opportunity to expose the problems with Thompson's testimony, but he also knew that his inexperience might prevent him from maximizing the advantage that Thompson had inadvertently handed him. Sergeant Thompson, you mentioned that you've received cultural sensitivity training. Is that correct? Yes, that's correct. And part of that training would have included instruction about not making assumptions about people based on how they speak or their cultural background, wouldn't it? Thompson's confident expression faltered slightly. Well, yes, but this wasn't about cultural assumptions. This was about the defendant's behavior and attitude. But you just testified that the defendant's manner of speaking told you everything you needed to know about what kind of person he was. Isn't that exactly the kind of assumption your training was designed to prevent? Thompson's face began to redden slightly. He was beginning to realize that his testimony hadn't been as effective as he had thought, but his pride prevented him from backing down. I was referring to his attitude and his refusal to cooperate, not his accent or dialect. But you made specific efforts to recreate what you claimed were his exact words, complete with what you called an urban dialect. Why was it important for you to imitate the way you claim he spoke? The question hung in the air, and Thompson struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make his bias even more obvious. I was just trying to be accurate in my testimony. Accurate. Chen's confidence was growing as he realized how badly Thompson had damaged his own credibility. Do you always imitate the accents and speech patterns of defendants when you testify? No, but have you ever imitated the accent of a white defendant in your testimony? Thompson's silence spoke volumes. The courtroom was completely quiet except for the soft clicking of the court reporter's machine and the barely audible hum of the air conditioning system. I'll take that as a no, Chin continued. "Sergeant Thompson, isn't it true that you arrested my client not because of his behavior, but because you made assumptions about him based on his race and the way you perceived him to be speaking?" "Absolutely not," Thompson replied hotly. "I arrested him because he was being uncooperative and disrespectful." But even as Thompson denied the accusation, everyone in the courtroom could see that his credibility had been severely damaged. His own words had revealed the bias that had influenced his actions, and no amount of denial could undo the impression he had created. Chun returned to his seat knowing that he had scored significant points, but uncertain about how to capitalize on them. His client had remained silent throughout the proceedings, but Chun noticed that Jamal's expression had changed subtly. There was something in his eyes now, not anger or frustration, but what looked almost like anticipation, as if he were waiting for something. Judge Hernandez looked down at her notes, her expression troubled. In 12 years on the bench, she had seen many cases involving allegations of police bias, but rarely had she witnessed an officer so clearly reveal his prejudices in his own testimony. Thompson's performance had been so problematic that she was beginning to wonder whether there were other issues with this case that hadn't yet come to light. "Mr. Chun," she said, "does the defense wish to present any witnesses or evidence?" Chun stood again, consulting his notes one final time. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call the defendant, Jamal Washington, to testify on his own behalf." The announcement created a small stir in the courtroom. Defendants in minor traffic cases rarely testified in their own defense, preferring to avoid the risk of cross-examination. But as Jamal rose from his chair and walked toward the witness stand, there was something in his bearing that suggested this would not be ordinary testimony. Thompson watched from his seat in the gallery, his confidence slowly returning. He had testified against dozens of defendants over the years, and he had learned that most of them only made things worse for themselves when they took the stand. Whatever Jamal Washington was planning to say, Thompson was certain it would only confirm his assessment of the man as an inarticulate troublemaker who had brought his legal problems on himself. But as Jamal approached the witness stand, preparing to take an oath that would require him to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, no one in that courtroom could have predicted what was about to happen. They couldn't have known that they were about to witness one of the most devastating reversals in courtroom history, or that Thompson's confident assumptions were about to be shattered in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The bailiff held up her right hand, preparing to administer the oath that would begin Jamal's testimony. And as Jamal raised his own right hand to swear that his testimony would be truthful, the atmosphere in courtroom 3B began to change in ways that no one present would ever forget. "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Jamal replied. And with those two simple words, everything changed. The voice that emerged from Jamal's mouth was not the voice Thompson had described. It was clear, articulate, and carried the precise diction of someone with extensive education. There was no trace of the urban dialect Thompson had mocked so thoroughly just minutes before. Judge Hernandez looked up sharply from her notes, her eyebrows rising slightly as she registered the stark contrast between Thompson's testimony and the reality of how Jamal actually spoke. "Please state your name for the record," Michaelton said, though he too seemed surprised by the transformation in his client's voice. "Dr. Jamal Marcus Washington," came the reply, each word enunciated with the precision of someone accustomed to addressing academic audiences. The word doctor hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. Several people in the gallery leaned forward in their seats. Thompson's confident expression flickered for just a moment before returning, though those watching closely might have noticed a slight tension around his eyes. "And what is your occupation, Dr. Washington?" Chun continued, his voice carrying a new note of curiosity. Jamal straightened slightly in the witness chair, his professional bearing now unmistakable. "I am a professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School, specializing in civil rights litigation and police misconduct cases." The silence that followed was so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Thompson's face went pale. The confident smirk that had carried him through 20 years of testimony vanished, as if someone had flipped a switch. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again without producing any sound. Harvard Law School. Constitutional Law. Police Misconduct Specialist. The words echoed in his mind like a death sentence. This wasn't some urban troublemaker he had arrested. This was a professor who had dedicated his career to studying exactly the kind of behavior Thompson had just displayed in open court. Judge Hernandez stared at Dr. Washington, then turned to look at Thompson, her expression shifting from surprise to something approaching disbelief. In 12 years on the bench, she had never seen an officer so thoroughly destroy his own credibility. District Attorney Martinez felt her stomach drop. She realized she had just prosecuted a Harvard law professor based on testimony that could now be used as a textbook example of racial profiling. In the gallery, law students frantically scribbled notes, recognizing they were witnessing legal history in the making. Thompson tried to swallow, but his mouth had gone completely dry. 20 years of built reputation, gone in an instant. Dr. Washington remained calm, waiting patiently for the next question, as if oblivious to the chaos his simple introduction had created. Dr. Washington looked directly at Sergeant Thompson, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years teaching constitutional law to future attorneys and judges. Sergeant Thompson, he began, his tone professional, but with an edge of steel that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward. You've just provided this court with a textbook example of racial and linguistic profiling that I will undoubtedly be using in my Harvard Law School seminars for years to come. Thompson's face had gone from pale to gray. He tried to speak, but only managed a strangled whisper. That's not. Let me be very clear about what happened here today, Dr. Washington continued, his voice cutting through Thompson's attempted denial. You pulled me over for allegedly failing to signal. When I spoke to you in what you perceived as African American vernacular English, a legitimate linguistic variety that I sometimes employ, particularly when I'm nervous or stressed, you made immediate assumptions about my intelligence, my character, and my credibility. Judge Hernandez was taking notes furiously, her expression showing a mixture of fascination and horror at what she was witnessing. You then proceeded to testify under oath in this courtroom, using an exaggerated and offensive caricature of African American speech patterns to mock and demean me. You stated, and I quote from the court record, that my manner of speaking told you everything you needed to know about what kind of person I was. Dr. Washington pulled out his own notebook, not the hastily scribbled notes of a nervous defendant, but the precise documentation of a legal scholar who understood the importance of evidence. What you didn't know, Sergeant Thompson, is that I was returning from a lecture I had just delivered to the LAPD's Internal Affairs Division about identifying and preventing exactly this type of misconduct. Your own department invited me to help train officers to avoid the very behavior you've just demonstrated. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of someone's phone vibrating in the gallery seemed deafening. I have a PhD in constitutional law from Yale University, a JD from Harvard Law School, where I graduated summa cum laude, and I've published 17 peer-reviewed articles on police misconduct and civil rights violations. I've testified before Congress on police reform, and I've consulted with the Department of Justice on pattern and practice investigations into police departments across the country. Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. More importantly for your career, Sergeant Thompson, I've been recording our entire interaction. Dr. Washington reached into his jacket and pulled out a small digital recording device. This device captured our complete conversation during the traffic stop, including your actual words to me and my actual responses, none of which bear any resemblance to the theatrical performance you just gave this court. District Attorney Martinez stood up abruptly. Your Honor, I need to request an immediate recess to confer with my office. But Dr. Washington wasn't finished. The recording will show that I spoke to you with complete respect and professionalism. I identified myself as Dr. Washington, provided my Harvard Law School faculty ID along with my driver's license, and calmly explained that I was returning from a police training seminar. You chose to ignore my credentials and arrest me anyway. Judge Hernandez looked at Thompson with an expression of complete disbelief. Sergeant Thompson, is this true? Did the defendant identify himself as Dr. Washington and provide academic credentials during the traffic stop? Thompson's mouth moved soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to whisper, I don't recall. You don't recall, Dr. Washington repeated, his voice now carrying the tone of a professor addressing a particularly slow student. Well, perhaps this will refresh your memory. He activated the recording device, and his own voice filled the courtroom, calm, professional, and speaking in perfect standard American English. Good afternoon, officer. I'm Dr. Jamal Washington from Harvard Law School. Here's my driver's license and registration, along with my faculty identification. I was just returning from a training seminar I conducted for your Internal Affairs Division. Then came Thompson's voice, dripping with disdain. Sure you are, pal. And I'm the chief of police. Step out of the vehicle. The recording continued, capturing Thompson's escalating hostility and his complete dismissal of Dr. Washington's credentials, followed by the arrest of a Harvard law professor for the crime of existing while black in an expensive car. When the recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Hernandez removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. Sergeant Thompson, I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you ignore the defendant's identification as a Harvard law professor and arrest him anyway? Thompson's career, his reputation, and his pension were crumbling in real time. Your Honor, he didn't seem. I thought he was lying. You thought a Harvard law professor was lying about being a Harvard law professor, Dr. Washington said, his voice calm but devastating. Based on what evidence, Sergeant Thompson? Based on the color of my skin? Based on your assumption that black men can't possibly be Ivy League professors? Based on your belief that anyone who speaks in African American vernacular English must be unintelligent or dishonest? Thompson said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Dr. Washington turned to address the entire courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed here today is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of behavior that affects thousands of Americans every day. I was arrested not because I committed a crime, but because Sergeant Thompson couldn't conceive of a world where someone who looked like me could hold the credentials I hold. He looked back at Thompson one final time. Sergeant Thompson, you've just provided me with the most compelling evidence I've ever encountered for why police reform is not just necessary, but urgent. Your testimony today will be studied in law schools and police academies for decades as an example of how unconscious bias can lead to violations of citizens' constitutional rights. Judge Hernandez had heard enough. All charges against Dr. Washington are hereby dismissed. Bailiff, please contact Internal Affairs immediately. I want a full investigation into this arrest and Sergeant Thompson's conduct. She turned to Thompson, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. Sergeant Thompson, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential perjury charges. Your testimony today was not only inappropriate, it was demonstrably false based on the evidence presented. Thompson sat in stunned silence as his world collapsed around him. But the story doesn't end there. The look on Thompson's face when he realized he'd just mocked a Harvard law professor was absolutely priceless. But what happened to his career after this courtroom disaster will shock you even more. If you're loving this instant karma moment, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's prejudice backfire this spectacularly? Because what happens next will show you exactly why you should never judge someone by their appearance, their accent, or your assumptions about their background. The consequences for Thompson were about to get much, much worse. Dr. Washington's recording didn't just destroy Thompson's case. It launched a federal investigation that would expose a pattern of misconduct spanning Thompson's entire career. Within 48 hours, the FBI had opened a civil rights investigation. Within a week, 17 other victims of Thompson's racial profiling had come forward with similar stories. The dash cam footage from Thompson's patrol car told an even more damaging story. While Thompson claimed the camera had malfunctioned, digital forensics experts recovered deleted files showing him laughing with his partner about teaching another one a lesson immediately after Dr. Washington's arrest. 3 months later, Thompson was terminated from the LAPD, stripped of his pension, and facing federal civil rights charges. The officer who had spent 20 years building his reputation through fear and intimidation was now unemployed, unemployable in law enforcement, and facing potential prison time. Dr. Washington used the incident to launch a comprehensive study of racial profiling in traffic stops, funded by a Department of Justice grant. His research, titled The Thompson Effect: How Linguistic Bias Enables Constitutional Violations, became required reading in police academies nationwide. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was when Thompson was forced to attend a court-mandated racial bias training seminar, taught by none other than Dr. Jamal Washington himself. The former sergeant sat in the back row, avoiding eye contact, as the Harvard professor he had mocked explained to a room full of officers why assumptions based on race and language were not just morally wrong, but legally dangerous. Thompson never spoke publicly about the incident, but those who knew him said it fundamentally changed him. The arrogance and swagger that had defined his personality for decades were gone, replaced by the quiet desperation of someone who had lost everything due to his own prejudices. Meanwhile, Dr. Washington continued his work at Harvard, though he became somewhat of a celebrity in legal circles. Students would pack his constitutional law seminars, hoping to hear more details about the Thompson case. He used his newfound platform to advocate for police reform, always emphasizing that education and patience were more powerful weapons against injustice than anger or violence. The courtroom where it all happened was eventually renamed the Civil Rights Education Center, though Dr. Washington protested the honor. "It shouldn't be named after me," he said at the dedication ceremony. "It should be named for every person who's been judged by their accent instead of their accomplishments, for everyone who's been dismissed because of how they look instead of what they know." 5 years later, Dr. Washington was appointed to serve on a federal commission tasked with reforming police training standards nationwide. His first recommendation was that all officers be required to study the Thompson transcript, the court record of Sergeant Thompson's testimony, and its aftermath. The intersection where Thompson had pulled over Dr. Washington was eventually marked with a small plaque. Here, prejudice met preparation, and preparation won. Sergeant Rick Thompson learned the hard way that in America, you might be able to fool some people with bias and bluster, but eventually you'll encounter someone who has the knowledge, the patience, and the credentials to expose you for exactly what you are. Dr. Jamal Washington proved that sometimes the most powerful response to ignorance isn't anger. It's simply being so undeniably qualified that your accusers destroy themselves with their own assumptions. What's your take on this story? Do you think Dr. Washington should have revealed his credentials immediately to avoid the arrest, or was allowing Thompson to expose himself the better strategy for creating lasting change? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspectives always help me see these stories from new angles. If stories about education triumphing over ignorance, justice prevailing over prejudice, and people standing up to discrimination are your thing, you'll definitely want to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We cover cases like this every week, showing how knowledge, preparation, and dignity can overcome even the most entrenched bias. Next week, we're covering the case of the retail manager who thought she could humiliate a welfare mom buying groceries with food stamps, until she discovered that welfare mom was actually an undercover federal inspector conducting a discrimination investigation. The look on her face when the inspector revealed her badge was absolutely priceless. Until then, remember what Dr. Washington proved in that courtroom. Your accent doesn't determine your intelligence, your appearance doesn't define your worth. And sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice is simply being so qualified that your critics defeat themselves. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.